All right, guys, so there was a lot of comments, a lot of controversy recently on the Greg Doucette and Mike Israetel debate, so I wanted to touch on that here. A lot of people were talking about the 10% rule, Greg's recommendation versus Mike's, who was more accurate, who was better in the debate. Obviously there were a lot of comments on Mike Israetel's tone and how he went about that, so I wanted to touch on all of that here. So I will say, going back and watching that podcast, that interview, if you were to just watch that, I would agree kind of with all the comments where it does seem like Mike is really antagonizing Greg, like Greg seems humble. It's a little confusing because, I've met Mike and he's a very friendly guy. He's sarcastic, but that is not his normal tone from what I've seen. So I was kind of surprised by that, and almost 100% of the comments were against Mike there. So as I watched the whole interview, that was kind of my takeaway as well. And then I went back and I watched everything. So I watched Greg Doucette's original video, then I watched Mike's response to that, and then I watched Greg. And I have to say that as much as Mike was maybe kind of attacking Greg in that podcast, I wouldn't say that Greg was completely innocent there in terms of his approach. He was clearly a lot more humble. He was really willing to learn, it seemed, when he was talking directly with Mike. But on his videos, he said a lot of things about Mike and other people and how they train, and I know he says he's just trying to call it objectively, but he really did seem to have some different messages in the podcast, the debate, compared to his own videos. The main one I noticed was that he constantly said, train harder, go to failure, and in the debate, he said that, a few reps shy was fine. He said that was stimulatory for hypertrophy. In his video, he said that's training like a wimp. He said that's how he trains when he gets pneumonia. I really did feel like he changed his tone where, in his own videos, he says that at the end of a set, you should be able to get a 0 more reps after that, even if somebody had a gun to your head. And now, on the debate, he was kind of agreeing, saying, you can train a little bit away from failure. Now, I do want to touch on that 10% rule that was mentioned because that seemed to be what was really harped on. The only other comments I wanted to make are going back and watching Greg's final response video there, the one right before the debate. He would say things like Jeff Nippard could look really good. He looks good, but he could look great. Or Greg O'Gallagher for like Kino Body looks good, but he could look great if they just trained harder. And I think it's fine advice to tell people to train harder, but I have to say that if you're watching this video, if you're watching these videos, I don't know if that's really most people's problem. I think there is a problem out there with people at the gym not training hard enough, but I have to say, I don't think Greg O'Gallagher or Jeff Nippard would look better if they were just taking every set to failure. I know that, you could debate on what the research shows because maybe it's not in advanced athletes, but the problem with this is there's really huge people from every camp, right? You have the low volume HIT guys, the Mike Menser guys, even like DC training. That is technically still pretty low volume but higher frequency. And there are massive guys, natural and enhanced, in that camp. You have guys who follow the high volume, high reps workouts and maybe staying away from failure, maybe going to failure. Everything in between these, you have huge individuals. Mike Israetel was talking about how it's largely genetics, and I agree with that. It is. You have to assume consistency, obviously. You have to consume progression over time. You have to consume good caloric intake and sleep. But once you have all that down, one time a week, even nobody wants to talk about 1 time per week training anymore in terms of frequency. That's how people got huge for decades and decades. And I'm not saying that's optimal. I think 2 to 3 times per week is probably better for most people. But we're talking small differences here. This is not a huge difference. Your split is not going to make this monumental difference unless you're talking about like a horrendous split versus a more optimal one. Your frequency isn't going to make a giant difference. If you're training to failure or a little past failure or 1 rep shy of failure, it's not going to make a huge difference in the grand scheme of things over time. Maybe if you looked at a 1 year of training, it might have maybe this group gain 10% more than this group. But if you're talking a consistent lifetime of lifting, 12, 15, 20 years, at the end of the day, I really don't think it's going to matter that much. I think Jeff Nippard is probably as big as he's ever going to get naturally. I don't think training to failure is going to, on every set, is going to make that much of a difference. Same thing with Greg O'Gallagher. He looks great. He's got a pretty much ideal physique for a lot of people who are kind of outside the fitness industry. That's what a lot of people want to look like, that kind of lean, muscular but very lean look. So I really don't actually think it really matters that much. If you love training to failure, you are going to probably have to back off the volume. If you want to do higher volume, you're probably going to have to back off the intensity a little bit. But ultimately, I don't think you're talking massive differences here. So finally, let's talk about this 10% rule that was brought up so many times. So my understanding, the way it was explained to me, the way I got it from Greg's videos, is that you will do your first set. Then you will take 10% of the weight off, and you will keep going until you cannot repeat that same number of reps. So for example, you do 300 pounds for 10 reps. The next set, you would do 270 pounds. And if you get 11 reps, great. The next set, you only get 9 reps. Okay, you're done. Now, something I will say, he kind of made it a little bit more confusing there, because at one point he said, if you can't get it, you're done. At another point, he said, if you can't get it, rest longer. And then if you don't get it at the next attempt, then you're done. Well, if you're doing, let's say, 3 or 4 exercises, that could be the difference of doing, let's say, 2 sets per those 4 exercises, or 3 sets per those 4 exercises. So you could be talking about 8 sets, or you could be talking about 12 sets if you were to keep trying to attempt it a second time after failing. So I did notice he said that. That's a little bit of disparity, but for the most part, his message was take 10% of the weight off. Once you can't hit the requisite number of reps anymore, then you're done. Mike Israetel's point there was saying that that is an exercise regulator, not a volume regulator. So what does that mean? Basically that's when you go on to your next exercise. But does that mean you're done for that body part, or do you go on to the next exercise? So, if it's your first exercise for chest and you're doing bench press, presumably when you're done, you're going to go on to another exercise. But if it's the 3rd or 4th one, then maybe you're done for the day. So I'm sure Greg's counter argument would be, you're going to know how many exercises you're doing, and then that it is going to be a volume regulator in the sense of maybe you only get 2 sets, or maybe you get 4. Maybe if you have, you're better with endurance, you might end up being able to do 4 sets per exercise, and so then it would be 16 versus for somebody else, maybe they're more fast switch dominant, something like that. They only get 2 sets. Now it's only 8 sets per workout. So I would agree with Mike that it is an exercise regulator, but that will inherently take care of volume in a sense if you know how many exercises you're planning to do. Mike's method is obviously different. He's not just looking at a percentage of anything really. He's saying, you want to pick a minimum effective volume, whatever that is for a given body part. That can change over time with training age and other variables. That can change if you're bulking or cutting, etc. But you want to have a minimum effective volume. You want to increase that over the course of a mesocycle. You get to your maximum recoverable volume, and then you deload. Over that time, you're also increasing your intensity. So you might stay 3-4 reps away from failure, and by the end, you're hitting failure maybe on almost every set you do, or every exercise you do. And so there are obviously different methods there. A lot of the complaints people have with Mike's method is it's, well, how many sets do you do? Do you do 3 or 12 sets? How do you know which one to do? Obviously, there's going to be some trial and error here. I would say if you're new to training, or even if you're intermediate, see what volume you're able to make progress on. If you're not making progress and your calories are okay, your sleep is okay, your training isn't ridiculously flawed, then you can probably go up in sets if you're not making progress. There's also going to be a point where you're just going backwards or not making any more progress by adding sets. That would, in theory, be your maximum recoverable volume. Now, personally, I don't subscribe to that much. I believe in the definitions. Of course, there's some minimum effective volume. Of course, there's some maximum recoverable volume. Just by definition, those have to be there. As Mike Israetel points out, the more advanced you get, the more narrow that range becomes between the MEV and the MRV. I think for most people, I don't see that much of a difference in doing that. I have experimented with it. I think it's fine. I think it's one method. At the end of the day, if you had 2 people following, one person was following Greg's method, one was following Mike's method, over 10 years, assuming calories, everything else was similar, would there be that huge of a difference? I personally don't think so. I think consistency, genetics, all of that are going to make the biggest factor. And obviously, if you're enhanced, that's a huge factor as well. I don't think it's completely necessary to be cycling the volume to that extent, but I also don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think it can help you stay meticulous with your training. And there might be small advantages. I'm just saying that for most people, I don't think it's going to matter that much. And I've actually even had Mike on this channel saying that he doesn't think it's going to make that much of a difference for most people. But he's talking about somebody who wants to be as ideal as possible, gain every last ounce of muscle possible. And in that case, it might make a small difference. Having said that, I also wouldn't really criticize Greg so much in the sense that I don't think there's any, I would agree that it's arbitrary, that 10%. Greg says it is as well. It could be 9, it could be 11%. So Mike's point is, why 10? Why are you enforcing this 10% rule? And I would agree, there's not really a reason to enforce the 10% rule. However, it is just one way to regulate how much you're doing. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it. I wouldn't say it's scientific. I wouldn't say it's really based on any concrete evidence that that's the ideal way to do it. But I think it's a fine way to regulate volume. Actually, years ago, 3DMJ, I remember handing a template to my friend for, they had coached him or done a consult with him, and he had shown me the program that they had mentioned. And it basically was that you do a set, and then you have kind of like back off sets until you get to a certain RPE. So basically it'd be like, you do a weight, you back off until that RPE for that lower weight becomes, let's say, a 9, you can keep doing sets. Well, that's a similar principle, and that is by 3DMJ. Now, I don't know if they still do this. This was 5-6 years ago, but my point is, it's just a method to regulate volume. If you're feeling amazing that day, it allows you to do a little bit more. If you're feeling really crappy, you're going to end up doing less. So it's a way to auto-regulate, and I think it's fine in that regard. And I really also don't think that everything you do has to be perfectly scientific or has to have a ton of studies validating it. For example, Mike Israetel himself mentions that you should be feeling a pump, that if you're not feeling any pump in the muscle, you're probably not really growing that muscle. Personally, I wouldn't agree with that. I think most powerlifters, or a lot of powerlifters, go a long time without feeling much of a pump. Now, it's not actually true that powerlifters are constantly doing low reps. Many powerlifters do higher reps. But you're not going to convince me that if you get your overhead press from 65 pounds for 5 reps up to 135 pounds for 5 reps, that your shoulders didn't grow. They're certainly going to grow, and I really doubt that you're getting much of a pump from those 5 rep sets. But he might be right that getting a pump is somewhat indicative of that you're feeling the muscle, that the muscle that you're trying to work is working. I think at times soreness can be a good indicator, but clearly soreness is not necessary because that can be genetic as well. There are people who get extremely sore from minimal volume. There are people who can do tons of volume and not get sore. Part of that is genetics, part of that is if you're used to it. My point is just that you don't need to have 10 studies backing up everything you do. At the end of the day, this is supposed to be fun. There are a lot of ways to hit the end goal. I think it's great to have science supporting what you're doing. And I wouldn't necessarily agree. I think people kind of laugh that Greg made a comment that we don't know anything. We do know some things, but at the end of the day, it's still important to make sure you're focusing on the big picture here. It's great to debate these things. It's fun for people like me. I like to look into those details. But don't get into that paralysis by analysis. Make sure you're enjoying what you're doing. Make sure you're progressing, eating right, sleeping right, and you're gonna make progress. So I thought it was actually an interesting debate. Obviously, people do like the controversy there. I think it's fun. I think it's interesting. But don't get too caught up in the small details. I think you can learn from both of those guys. I think you can learn from me. So subscribe to all of us. I think we all put out good content. I think there's a lot of people you can learn from, so I wouldn't just get into one camp and ignore everybody else. So I hope this clarified for some people the different points that were made. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. We're gonna have more content like this, more informational videos, more podcasts coming out. So see you guys next time.